Welcome to the Abundance Code, the podcast where we delve into the secrets of unlocking abundance in mind, money, and meaning. I'm your host, Jason Stanley.
And the problem that we have is that we are being fed all the wrong information on money. If you look, history is replete with people who have done that and they lose it all. Welcome back to the Abundance Code, where we discuss mind, money, and meaning. I'm Jason Stanley. All right. So let's talk about money, right? A lot of people want to shy away from this subject. A lot of people want to talk about this subject. A lot of people want to know how to make money and all this stuff. Money is simply a tool, right? It is simply a tool, and it will amplify in your life whatever you're good or whatever you're bad at. And I use this example. So I forget the exact statistic. Roughly something like over 70% of all NBA, NFL players are bankrupt within 3 years of leaving the league. Lottery winners are usually bankrupt within 5 years of winning the lottery. How the heck does that happen? How do you win hundreds of millions of dollars? How do you get contracts for, $40, $50, $60 million a year to play a sport for a period of time, and yet at the end, you don't have anything to show for it? What happens in that process? And the problem that we have is that we are being fed all the wrong information on money. Our perceptions, right, similar to what we talked about in this last episode, our perceptions are that in order for you to be rich, you have to look rich and you have to have all these things, right? We see the fancy cars, the fancy clothing, and all of these things. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with having some of those things, it's that when you get into that mindset of consumerism, and once you start running down that path and you're trying to fulfill yourself by buying stuff, you're actually setting yourself up for failure. And money, and if you look at people that are actually wealthy, people who've done well with people, it's interesting. I've got people that make $2 million a year that have less net worth than people that make $75,000 to $100,000 a year. Why? And the reason is really just has to do with how they look at money, how the language that they use around money, like we've talked about in previous episodes, and then also too their daily activities, their disciplines around money. And so a lot of times people write out goals. Hey, I want to get out of debt, and then they get out of debt and they go right back into it. And that's because money, just like your diet, just like everything else, is a lifestyle. It's a choice. How you handle your money, how you deal with things is a choice. It has to be a lifestyle for you. And it doesn't take a whole lot, but it takes being disciplined on a regular basis in order to see the compounding effects of it. Right? And again, I'll say that money will magnify whatever you're good at or whatever you're bad at in your life. In my own life, I found that to be true. I told you at one point in time I went homeless. And what happened was I was in school. I was in Chicago. And, the credit card companies are phenomenal with college students, or at least they were back then. And they handed credit cards to me like they were candy. And I had a bunch of them. And I used them. And I bought stuff, lots and lots of stuff. And then they wanted me to pay them. Why would I do that? That's why I had this credit card, is so that I could just go buy stuff, right? I didn't think about I had to pay them side. And while that sounds silly and we understand it, that's how most people live. Most people live buying stuff that they can't afford. And when you do that, you're setting yourself up for failure. And I set myself up for horrible failure, and the way that I ended up in the world that I'm in now is really an interesting story. I'll share it with you. So I had run up all this debt, and I couldn't make rent, and I was about to be evicted out of my apartment, and I called my father, collect on a payphone because my cell phone had been turned off, and actually cell phones were really expensive back then. You had roaming charges and all that kind of stuff. So I hadn't paid my bill. That was turned off. My cable was turned off. I literally had no furniture in this little studio apartment that I was living in. And I called my father and I said, hey, look, he owned a business at the time. And I said, hey, look, I need, I think it was something like $30,000 really to kind of get back to break even and to get caught up in rent. So to pay off all the credit cards and this is in the 90s. And so it was a lot of money. But I figured I'll appeal to his business nature. And so I said, hey, I need to borrow some money. I'll pay it back to you. And I threw an interest rate out, and, interest rates were a little bit higher back then. So I think I offered like 6% or something like that. Knowing full well that I really wasn't going to change my lifestyle, right? I was just going to get the money, pay everything off, and then just probably go right back to the way I was living before, because that's what we tend to do. And so he says, okay, I'll send you something to help you out. And a couple days later, I get a package in the mail, and there's a book in it. And so, I toss the book off to the side and dig in the package, and there's no check in there. So I flip through the pages of the book because he must have put the check in there, right? And there's no check there either. So I go back downstairs. I lived in a high rise. I go back down to the parking garage, get on this payphone. I call him collect again. He answers. And I said, hey, Dad, you didn't put the check in there. He said, I'm not sending you any more money. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, I'm not sending you any more money. If you want to start learning about money, great, read the book. And I had some choice words for him. Very angrily hung up the phone and didn't talk to him for a period of time. And I'll never forget, I was living in that apartment. I actually ended up finding somebody to sublease it from me so that I didn't have to get evicted. So I didn't have an eviction on my record, kind of thing. I don't know if those go on your record or not. I just know I didn't want to be evicted. But I got somebody to come in and lease it. So I had to move out anyway, but I'm sitting there, and I was a different person back then. And my apartment was just a mess. I was a mess. I partied too much. I drank too much. I smoked too much. I did everything. Everything about me was anything but what I am today. And, so I'm sitting there in this fold out chair, in my apartment with no furniture. I got a mattress on the floor. And I smoked back then, and I couldn't even buy cigarettes. I didn't even have the money to buy cigarettes. I'm looking around, and there's all these empty cigarette packages laying around. And I wanted a cigarette at the time, and so I went around, I pulled the foil out and got all the tobacco together, and I had some rolling papers. I'm not going to say as to why I had rolling papers, but I had some rolling papers, and I rolled a cigarette, and I lit it, and I started smoking it. And I remember thinking at the time, God, this sucks. How did I end up in this position? I'm so addicted to smoking that I'm literally pulling dry tobacco out of cigarette cartons to be able to have a cigarette to smoke. I wasn't healthy. I wasn't going anywhere in life. And I was about to be homeless. And I remember I was sitting there and I'm smoking that cigarette, and I look across the room and laying on the floor right where I threw it weeks prior was that book. And so I walked over, I picked it up, I said, oh, what the hell's this thing about? And I started reading it and immediately was hooked on it. It's a great book. It's called Rich Dad Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki. And I would call it a gateway drug into money and money mindset. I've since parted ways with a lot of Robert Kiyosaki's thoughts and teachings and stuff, because I went on to understand finance and get degrees in finance and so on and so forth. But it really started to change the way that I looked at and how I handled money and what I did with money. But I didn't do it overnight. I still ended up going homeless. I couch surfed on friends' couches. I lived on the patio of Pizzeria Due, downtown Chicago. If you ever go up there, I waited tables there. And so a lot of times I would spend the night on the patio, get up in the morning, walk down to the Borders bookstore, which was on the corner of Michigan Avenue and the Water Tower area. And I would grab these books on money and I would go upstairs and read them. And the cool thing was I didn't have to buy them. And so, because I didn't have the money to buy them, so I would just sit and devour these books on money, and it started to make a lot of sense to me. And I started to see where I had gone wrong. Again, I started looking at started reading these books. I started looking at different things, but nothing significant really changed in my life, right? I still really was kind of in the same boat. I was still unhealthy. I still was, broke. I was still all these different things, but I started to develop a vision for what I wanted for my life. I started to develop, what I wanted to see for myself. And what I realized in doing that was that it wasn't one decision that had got me to that spot. Right? It wasn't the one time that I used a credit card to go buy a pair of clothes that I couldn't afford, or to buy a dinner for a young lady that I was dating that I couldn't afford. It wasn't just doing that one time. It was a compounded effect of doing that over and over and over and over again until it finally cascaded into what it became. And what that became was, I didn't have a home. And that starts to add a lot of, you gain a lot of perspective when all of a sudden you don't have a home. And so, a lot of people say, well, how could your parents do that to you? Why would they let you do that? And I would say that was absolutely one of the best things that my parents ever did for me, was to let me go through that experience, because it started to give me perspective. I knew that I wanted more, and I knew that I was going to have to change. And Tony Robbins talks about this. If you get enough pain in your life in something, it gives you leverage to change that behavior. And that's what that did for me. It just gave me the leverage to start changing that behavior. It was years. It took years to undo all of that. And I was in my early 20s when all this took place. So I was roughly 23 years old or so. Ended up, a girl that I was dating worked for a very wealthy family at the time. Ended up getting to spend some time with them. Really liked their lifestyle. I got to see what the other side lived like. I got to see what was important to them. And I ended up going back to school, studying finance. And then from there, spent 7 years in the military, because I recognized that I was lacking discipline in my life. And so the military was a great place for me to develop those disciplines, and got out of the military and then started what I'm doing today. And who I am today and what I've been able to accomplish today would never have been possible had I not gone through that whole experience, right? And so how does this all tie back in? Well, it really ties back in that the way that you view and handle money, though your mindset's around it, will affect how much of it you're able to have and how much of it comes into your world. Also, too, like we talked about this last time, your network. As your network grows, your opportunities grow. And a lot of times we get wrapped up in just hanging out with our core group of friends, and we don't want to expand that. Anyway, so your network is important, and it helps you be able to expand opportunity. But being successful with money starts by doing daily habits. It doesn't mean that you can't have a life, doesn't mean that you can't go do fun things, doesn't mean that you can't spend money, right? And there's two extremes, and I see people do these extremes all the time. I see people who spend way more than they earn. I see people who don't enjoy life and they live a deferred life, and I would say that you can't do either one of those. If you do those, you're really not living, number one, in the moment where you're at, and number two, I think you'll find yourself pretty frustrated. Instead, you have to find that balance. And you have to be able to say, okay, I'm going to do these things. And so it's starting small, right? And Dave Ramsey's got some great information on how to help you get out of debt. And in fact, it's not, I would say that his advice isn't even necessarily financially sound advice. In my world as a person in finance, I would always tell you to start with your highest interest debt and pay that off first, and then go to the next one, so on and so forth. But what Dave does a great job of is teaching people how to win the psychological game. And so it's starting with the smallest and paying that one off. He calls it snowball, right? Starting with smallest debt that you have, pay that off, and then next one, so on and so forth. And when you pay stuff off, it does feel good, but you still have to change the way that you look at things and the way that you manage things. So this is not a episode about, oh, you shouldn't be in debt. This isn't an episode of, anything else. This is about how you handle money and how your mind affects how we handle money, right? So if you allow politics to affect whether or not is a good time to invest. So like I was saying in the beginning, though, if you look at people from the NFL, people from the NBA, you look at lottery winners and stuff, why is it that they keep going bankrupt? Everybody thinks, well, if I win the lottery, I'll be great with money. I'll never have any worries again. I'll be able to do this or do that. And the fact of the matter is it doesn't work. And the reason is the mindset isn't correct. And so you have to start by training your mind. And I've used this as an example for a long time. You ask 10 people how much money makes you rich, you get 10 different answers. You ask 10 people how little money makes you poor, you get 10 different answers. And so what that tells me is that prosperity or wealth and poverty are really just mindsets. Jordan Peterson talks about this. I've used this number for years. I think in order to be in the top 1% of all income earners in the world, you only need to make about $32,000 a year. And maybe you're below that. Maybe you're above that. And you don't feel wealthy, right? And I would tell you to start working on looking at the abundance in your life, right? Chances are, even if you don't have a big house or something, you have a cell phone. You have a car, you have air conditioning in the summer, you have heat in the winter, and you have a television. You live better than J.D. Rockefeller did. And so when you start to shift your thinking, you start to look at that and you start to look at the abundance in your life, it's a lot easier to create that more. But it has to become a habit. It has to become a habit of how you do things. So maybe it's that you put $5 a week away. Or maybe you can't afford $5 a week. Maybe it's $5 a month. You start doing that and it will compound over time into something bigger, right? Now, I'm not going to say it's going to make you a millionaire. Maybe you don't need to be a millionaire. Not everybody needs that in order to be content. So you have to figure out what you want in life and how you want to live, and then back into the dollars and cents from there. But you have to be disciplined in your approach to it. It's just like with your lifestyle. If you're healthy and you're fit, it's because you're disciplined in your diet, you're disciplined in going to the gym, you're disciplined in your workout routines, all of that stuff, right? If you're not, if you're overweight, you didn't get that way by eating McDonald's once, right? It's consistent behaviors, and maybe you have a medical condition or something like that. I don't know. It's a whole different situation. But when it comes down to your money's the same way. And we always want to skip all of the steps necessary to build wealth and just go straight to the point where we're wealthy. And I would say that if you look, history is replete with people who have done that and they lose it all. They don't hold on to it. Look at Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett's a great example. I love looking at this guy. Here he is in his 90s now, one of the richest men in the world. The only person on Forbes' list of richest that made all his money off of investing in the stock market. And yet he lives in the same house that he bought in the 70s. It's a good-sized house, but he bought it in the 70s. It's nothing fancy. He drives a nice car. but he's not driving Ferraris and Lamborghinis. He doesn't have homes everywhere. He doesn't have a yacht. He lives very simple. So why is he so successful with money? Well, the reason is because he's having fun. And he talks about this. He loves his business. He says, it's just a game to me, you know? And when you start to shift and you start to look at things like that, a lot of people look at money as work, and they look at money as being something that they have to deal with. They don't really want to deal with it. And I would say, shift your perspective. Have fun with it. And I don't mean have fun spending it. Have fun with it. See how much you can put away. See how you can grow it. You know, how do you put it and invest it into something and make it grow? It doesn't necessarily have to be in the stock market. Maybe you buy a piece of real estate or something along those lines. You know, think in terms of those things, and all of a sudden you'll start to change the way that you deal with money, and it won't be such a big headache. So think in those terms. Start changing the mindset that you have around money. Instead of focusing on the money you don't have, focus on what you do have. Focus on the abundance in your life, and focus on what you can do on a regular basis, right? Maybe you're in debt. Maybe you're in tons of debt. Maybe you live paycheck to paycheck. Maybe if gas prices go up, 10 cents, it's going to collapse your entire financial world. And if that's the case, then you really need to start looking at what can you start implementing now, right? Again, I've heard some people talk about this. If you find just one thing, you don't have to do this massive overhaul, right? I've never been somebody that can write out a budget and follow a budget. To me, that's tedious. I'm not going to put cash into envelopes and just use that. So I have these guidelines that I use in my life in order to put money away and to stay disciplined with it. So I know that I'm going to, put X amount of dollars each month into something and just leave it alone. I'm not going to look at it. I know that, whatever I have over here, I can spend and that kind of stuff. So it's developing a system that works for you and understanding how it works. But you got to be honest with yourself. You got to be honest with how you do things. And maybe you need a little bit of accountability in your life with it. But I'm going to tell you right now, there is no get rich fast scheme that works and works consistently. You might get lucky. You might hit something and get rich fast. Chances are, if you do, and you don't already have the discipline, you already don't have the education around finance, and you don't have the mindset to handle money, you'll lose it. And that, so start educating yourself. Read about it. Study it. A lot of times we want to ignore it. We want to pretend like it's not there. But if you start taking those little steps now, pick one thing about your financial life and work to improve it. And in doing so, I promise it'll overhaul the entire thing. It will take some time. I told you about my experience. I told you that I went on to, get a degree in finance. What I didn't tell you is between initially reading that book and finding some success was almost a 13-year time period. I left Chicago. I went back to Missouri. I got a job selling advertising for a little while. I left there, went to Virginia, joined the military, spent 7 years in Army aviation, did a couple tours in Iraq, that kind of stuff. Got out, started the business that I'm in now, had to go build it from the ground up, scraped, clawed, did everything that I could to win at it, and I'm in an industry that only 28% make it past 3 years. And I'm not beating my chest about that. I was fortunate in that I made the connections with the right people at the right time in order to be successful in this. And it's so. But when I look at how long it took for me to overhaul that part of my life and to change the trajectory of my life, it was quite a bit, and it took some work, and it took doing things that took me out of my comfort zone in order to do it. So if comfort is what you're after, then that's okay, but you're probably not going to, change a whole lot if you're comfortable where you're at. So you have to get uncomfortable. You have to be able to push yourself to grow and to learn. Study it. right? One of the things that people don't do is they don't study money. They don't study investing. They don't study any of these things. So start studying it. Take courses on it. Read books. It's so easy to do in today's world. If you don't like reading, listen to them, right? I listen to books all the time. I'm not somebody who sits down and reads a whole lot. I like to listen to books on audio. So again, start with something small. This is more about your mindset, but start with something small. Start with what you're thankful for. Every morning, every evening, say what you're thankful for. Be thankful for the abundance in your life. Focus on that, and then start with, figuring out how you're going to grow your wealth in some form or fashion. Doesn't have to be anything earth-shattering. It's a very simple process. But it is compounding effects. So yes, you've heard about compounding interests and stuff like that. This is a compounding behaviors. And, if you do it enough times, it will compound into something greater. In the meantime, as I've always said, buck the status quo in order to grow. Hope you got something out of this, and look forward to talking to you guys soon. Take care.